Let's see here. We got a crowd going now. All right.
I also have class at 1:30, so I'm gonna have to get off this Zoom call for that one.
No problem.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Yeah, y'all are you got gold stars for showing up. No big deal there. Let me see. I've got Jesse's muted. Well, you want to stay muted? You can stay muted if you want. But anyway, I wanted to make a few comments about the readings that I've posted because I didn't give you a lot of direction there, and then I want to try to maybe show you see what we can do here with Zoom. I'm not real. I'm not a good hand with Zoom yet, but we'll maybe experiment with it a little bit. We had a number of readings, or I've posted some readings for you that I don't know if you've had time to look at all of them yet, but I hope to give you some annotations or some notes on those, so you have an idea of what to look for. I'll do that within the lesson page within the modules. So the lessons, I'm trying to keep things as uncomplicated on Canvas as I possibly can. It's easy to make things very convoluted on that. So what we're going to do here is have lessons that are sort of the package for the theme, and you're going to have so many lessons within a module. Each lesson will have a quiz. Okay, so I don't know if we're in like the second lesson yet or not. We probably are. But let me tell you a little bit about, and you'll see those lessons on Canvas. Let me tell you a little bit about some of these readings and what I want you to get from them. All right, so now you should be seeing a share. All right. You see that little Canvas screen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So this is the introductory lesson, and I've listed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 readings here, and this is a lot of reading. In fact, one of this, I really screwed up here because I didn't give you the pages that I wanted you to read on number 3. All right, so just to ease your panic, all I wanted you to read on number 3, which is natural resources. Let me see if I can open that thing up. See if I can share a screen here. Stop share. I'll share a different one. Okay, we'll just do that again. And what I wanted to do is to show you these different readings. So the Governor's Conference on Conservation of Natural Resources from 1908 is just a brief newspaper article that describes the presidential or the White House conference that was hosted by Theodore Roosevelt in his outgoing few days. And what he did was he called in all of the governors of the states and basically tried to get them on board with the idea of conservation. And some historians point to this event in 1908 as sort of reshaping Americans' thought about conservation. And so I may show you a quick little video that's kind of neat. We usually, most of us already know that Theodore Roosevelt was probably the most conservation-oriented president we've ever had. It's true. And what's odd about that, is he was a Republican, but he was what they referred to as a progressive. Today we think Democrats, right? When we think of progressives, he was a Republican who loved the West. He loved nature, and he loved hunting, and he was both a friend of the conservation-minded people such as Gifford Pinchot. Of course, Gifford Pinchot was one of his great advisors. He was a forester. Okay, and you've got a second reading from Gifford Pinchot, which I'll make some comments about him in a little bit. But he was also who was also one of Teddy Roosevelt's good, important advisors, sort of informally? You think of any? Out west in California, the Scottish guy, John Muir, right? John Muir is sort of the personification of what I like to refer to as sort of the early environmentalist, an early environmentalist who actually was a founder. He was the founder of the Sierra Club, and the Sierra Club was founded on this philosophy that there are certain places in the world, certain parts of our world that should be preserved, should be held out of any sort of development or transformation by human hands, or simply the out of just because they are unique and they are special, and they shouldn't be exploited. They should be kept as pristine as possible for posterity, for the coming generations, so they can also enjoy it. And Muir almost took this to a religious sense. He was, and I think we see this today with many environmentalists. They consider this environmentalism is not something that can be negotiated. It's almost like a religious approach to the idea. Now, so Roosevelt was influenced by people who were both sort of rational pragmatists like Pinchot. And Pinchot really wasn't that much of a pragmatist. And then people like Muir, who were sort of hardcore, who we would call sort of hardcore environmentalists today. And that's significant. Roosevelt was his own man. He was not easily swayed, as many presidents have been in the past. So that way, he was really a real leader. And we'll talk more about Roosevelt, but that first reading is merely a description of that conference. And what I'd like for you to get from that reading is just kind of a sense of what the sort of the state of American thought was like at the time. And if you've read that, you'll notice that there's a discussion of sort of a inventorying of the resources of the continent. And with that inventory comes a sense of well, we can manage this stuff. We have the ability to affect the natural environment. Now, this is something that's fairly new in 1908, but it's been developing in the 19th century. And some folks these days in the last few decades would have referred to that as the sense of modernity or modernness. Okay. So you maybe have heard of postmodern thought, postmodernity. And so modernity is the idea that you have, it's what evolved in the early part of the 20th century, this idea that we can understand nature, we can understand reality, even we can understand human beings, and we can make steps to fix things and manage things, and whatever we need to. So, if for example, in terms of human behavior, we have the discipline of psychology, which is emerging around this time, and psychology essentially tries to bring solutions to human mental issues or whatever. Psychiatry, I guess. We have medicine. We have, in the natural world, we have the development of forestry, this idea that forests can be managed and improved, or at least kept to some degree useful. We have the role of industrialism taking place. So, and we even have city planning, things like this happening. So there are a lot of these changes in thought that are taking place around the turn of the 20th century. And modernity is a very broad idea, but within this grows up this conservation ideal. And I think that you'll get an idea for what I'm talking about if you just read that very short little discussion of, or description of, the 1908 Governor's Conference that was hosted at the White House. Another thing that will probably help you develop that idea of what I'm talking about is the little article, fairly short article by Gifford Pinchot. Well, let me show you what those look like. Let's see, yeah, this is the, I'm sorry, that's not it. Yeah, this is the article by Gifford Pinchot. Can you see that on your screen? And what Gifford Pinchot is doing here is trying to put forth the whole idea and rationale of conserving natural resources and why the United States needs to conserve natural resources. And he begins with a typical discussion that you'll see in other readings, in which he says, you know, the United States developed in an environment in which resources were so abundant that there was an idea that the resources that we would ever want would never run out, that they were inexhaustible. This is the idea of inexhaustibility, okay, or inexhaustible resources. And you'll see this in other textbooks. But the idea was, you know, America, or at least, you know, Americans thought that there's a superabundance of resources in North America that will, you know, it'll never be like Europe where there's some scarcity. It's always going to be there. So we don't really, there was never much of a need to try to even think about conserving things. The forests are one great example. Americans just, you know, when Americans started, or when the English started colonizing, you know, most of the Atlantic seaboard, they were, you know, they were in awe of this gargantuan forest that just stretched forever, they thought. And there was like nothing but forest. It was just huge. And to even begin to farm, they had to clear the land. So the land had to be removed, the forest had to be removed from the land in order to have the ability to farm. So forests were such a, you know, such an abundant resource that they were even considered kind of a nuisance. You know, they initially farmers would cut wood and they would use what they needed for heating, fencing, building, and they would often try to sell, if they could, any wood that to others. But most of the time, the resource, the timber resource, was just wasted if it wasn't used. So they had the ability to be very, very selective. Okay, I'm going to try to get through this through the idea here. Okay, so Gifford Pinchot in this reading sort of gives us a quick little simplistic discussion of where we came from. We came from abundance. And so Americans have always, he says, you know, basically Americans have always had this idea of abundance and have never really had to worry too much about scarcity of resources. But he says, now here we are in the 20th century, and we have, just by ignoring that whole idea that things can eventually be used up, we've come to a point to where we have leveled the forests, we have polluted the rivers, we have begun to use up all of our mineral resources, and so we've lost soil through erosion. So we really need to start think about using things in a way that is more prudent and more frugal, and so that they will be around for the future. Okay. Now this is a this is not anything new because we still see the same arguments going on today. I remember when I was in elementary school, junior high, and we were discussing the future. We were discussing the eradication of the Amazon rainforest. There were all sorts of predictions, predictions like, the Amazon rainforest will be gone in 20 years. Okay, and that was like in 1982, right? The Amazon rainforest is still with us, right? But I mean, there were these predictions of all of these awful things happening. You'll see here in this reading where Gifford Pinchot makes the argument that coal is on its way out. We're about to use all of our coal. Okay, we're about to use up all of our petroleum and gas, which we just really started to use in the early 20th century. So there have always in the conservation or in the conservation movement since the late 19th century, there have been these soothsayers, these predictions made by or warnings that have come out that if we don't take charge of our, if we don't take charge of the way things are used, then they're going to be used up. Okay. If we don't change our ways, things are going to go south. That's always the argument. Okay, I'm not going to say anything positive or negative or for or against that argument. I just want you to know that this has been going on for quite some time. I remember it as a kid growing up in my school days, and I still hear it today. Okay, the things change a little bit. Actually, when I was in school in the late 70s, early 80s, I remember arguments being made about climate change. Except there was this big difference between now and then. We were talking about possibilities of a new ice age coming in, okay? Believe it or not. All right. So there always have been these folks who have put forth dire warnings. All right. This is the quick little, this is the newspaper, or it's an article in Science Magazine, just a quick blurb. It starts at the bottom of that page 794 and goes just to about here. All right, so I'll click out of that. And this is the textbook that I failed to give you a reading assignment on. And I think one of you in class said, hey, are we supposed to read the whole thing? No, not right now at least. I would like for you to read the first couple of chapters in this, which goes through page 26. It's very easy to read. And look at how old this thing is, all right? It's, let's see the date, 1944. So it's a textbook. It's a conservation textbook from 1944. This is older than any of those that I've had you read, that I will have you reading for real. So the Conservation of Natural Resources, Henry Basil Wales, 1944, one of the earliest actual textbooks on conservation. And it begins, if you see, I want you to read the first two chapters for next week, the introduction, sort of a preview of conservation in the growth of the great nation, or excuse me, the first two chapters, the birth of the conservation idea, especially. So that one tells you about how conservation developed in the United States, or at least that's the gist of that chapter. But it'll walk you through some of the basics before we get into the other reading, which was a 1991 textbook. All right, so this will, I don't know if you can see me scrolling through all this. So this will bring you up to speed on sort of where conservation is oriented toward. Now, Gary Klee, the final reading in that list, I think it's the final reading, is the first chapter in a textbook by Gary Klee, okay? And this is a fairly this is one of the more recent textbooks in conservation. The textbook is actually the Conservation of Natural Resources, just like this class. This used to be the main textbook for the class. And this chapter is a very long one, and I have a number of questions on the quizzes directly from this chapter that you'll see. So you'll have a study guide for this particular reading that will walk you through the main questions that I want you to look at. I also have a timeline kind of like this, but it goes all the way up to the present in terms of conservation for the conservation events in the 20th century and even the 21st century. So you'll read about John Muir, you'll read about John Wesley Powell, if you're not familiar with those folks, Gifford Pinchot, Teddy Roosevelt.
I'm sorry, Dr. Bays. What chapters did you say we need to read in this one?
Well, this reading is this is the first chapter, this whole reading, this length.
Okay.
So, but you'll see more chapters from this textbook.
Okay. Thank you.
It's a good textbook, but I want you to remember that this one is written in the early 1990s by a geographer, and he's kind of you will get more of an environmentalism view from this reading than you will from the earlier stuff, which is more of a conservation pragmatist realist look. Okay, so throughout the class you're going to see both a sort of a conservation perspective from the standpoint of using resources, and then you're going to see more of an environmentalist perspective from the standpoint of preserving natural resources and not using natural resources, or trying our best to reduce use of natural resources, especially when it comes to things like fossil fuels that that lead to the global warming, climate change. So this is a fairly long one, but you'll see the introduction, and I'm going to have you'll see some videos a little bit that will tell you about people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, who you don't probably think of as conservationists, and they weren't. They were philosophy. They were literary people, but they were people who got the sort of the philosophy of conservation going very early on in the 19th century. So first half of the 19th century is when we begin to see this. You'll also read about early leaders like Jefferson, even George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, who, because they were well-read and plantation owners, they had also participated some in what we would call conservation efforts to preserve or to sustain agriculture. They were interested in sustainable agriculture early on. Okay, so that's one of the readings there, and then it takes you all the way up into some of the sort of the heroes of conservation in the 20th century, people like Aldo Leopold. Later on, folks like Rachel Carson, who environmentalists would certainly recognize. Anybody know what Rachel Carson was famous for? She was a marine biologist, and she wrote a number of books, but the most influential one was called Silent Spring, and it's kind of it's a sort of a watershed moment in the environmentalist movement in the United States. This book came out in the early 60s, and what it did was it targeted the use by agriculture of DDT in just an insecticide. It targeted and traced, it blamed the use of DDT on the on the loss of mostly birds. Okay, so but basically it was the first example of a book written for a popular audience, no less, a book written for a popular audience that attempted to explain environmental impact due to the use of something that most Americans would have considered wonderful, a wonderful product, DDT. Right, so DDT was considered a wonderful product because it killed insects so well, and therefore allowed agriculture to do very well. So it reduced the loss to insects, but of course, at the same time, what happened was DDT wound up being one of those chemicals that hangs around in the environment and then enters the food chain. And by the time it gets to the upper parts of the food chain, where you have birds eating, not eating insects and fish, the birds wind up not being able to have eggs that can be sustainable. So eggs crack and die. And so you have this loss of habit or loss of species way up the food chain. So it's an indirect impact of something that basically Americans used to allow agriculture to be more efficient. Of course, that was a real that wasn't an idea that everybody took lying down. A lot of people were very, very critical of her. And even today, people still, there's still kind of a questioning of whether or not this is, she was exactly right on everything. But one thing is sure, one thing is for sure, she got a following. And by the late 60s is when you see a true environmental movement taking place in the United States. And we see eventually, it sort of culminates in the first Earth Day. And then throughout the 1970s and the 1980s and 1990s, you see a continuous buildup of or growth in environmentalist thinking, different from conservation, but it comes from conservation. Okay. All right. That's kind of where I wanted to bring you today. I know it's only 30 minutes into this, but there's, since you're here, before I go to this, do you have any questions about the readings or format of the course, or questions about what to expect?
I had a question regarding the conservation of natural resources, the one by Wells and Lathrop.
Right.
He talks about the 4 X's in the history of land use: exploration, expansion, exploitation, and the exit. Mm-hmm. Are there any examples that you could kind of give us that we could look into?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's an idea, and it still persists in American history, about certain types of agriculture. Mostly this type of agriculture is associated with plantation agriculture. So probably the best example is the what's referred to as the soil mining process in tobacco production. Tobacco is a row crop, and it is a crop that takes an enormous amount of fertility out of the soil. It takes a lot of organic fertility out of the soil. So it's very hard on the soil. And one of the ideas that got started, I don't know when this got started, but maybe it was in the 19th century. As tobacco plantations got started in the area around the Chesapeake Bay of Virginia, for example, plantations typically expanded outward from the Chesapeake Bay into central, into the coastal plain in Piedmont of Virginia, also in other places like North Carolina. And tobacco was hard on the soil, or at least it promoted soil loss through the way that it's cultivated. It's a crop that has to be chopped or has to be weeded, and it's a row crop. So in a humid environment, soil is very prone to erosion wherever there's no cover. But the other side of that is that tobacco is very demanding on soil fertility. So you can't produce a lot of tobacco over a long period of time without practicing some sort of real, conservation through leaving land fallow and planting manure crops like soil nitrogen fixing crops like legumes.
Right.
And this was this kind of thing that Thomas Jefferson was actually interested in. Because he was a tobacco plantation owner. And so he actually looked into, fallowing land. And if you've ever visited Monticello, you've seen he has some, experiments. They show what he tried. He tried to do crop rotations to sort of keep the soil from losing fertility and losing its consistency over time. But the idea is that tobacco was so hard on soil that tobacco plantations basically had to leave. They had to move out of their zone, kind of like what we would call today in the rainforests of the world, slash and burn agriculture or swidden agriculture, where if you've ever read anything about that, a subsistence farming village or something goes, what they do is they clear the land, they burn all of the biomass on the land that they've cut down, all the trees, they burn that, and then that provides a bit of fertility infusion into the local soil. They're able to produce enough of a food crop for a few years from that plot to support a small population. But at the same time, they're always clearing land and they're abandoning land. And so it's really a matter of shifting agriculture is basically shifting fields. So the fields get shifted around and eventually they have to leave the whole area. So it's just kind of a mining operation of the soil.
Right.
Soil only lasts a little while, and oxysols in the tropics are notorious for that. It's the same idea that historians have said took place in places like Virginia, that the tobacco plantations would leave basically land that was not useful for much of anything. It didn't produce much of anything afterwards. So that's an example of what that particular textbook author calls that process of coming in, using it. It's abundant. What were the X's again? Exploitation or exploration?
Exploration, expansion, exploitation, and exit.
Exit. Yeah. So it's exploitation and exit. So they use it up and they get out. And there's another way of thinking about it. Do you happen to be from Oklahoma or Texas?
I'm from Oklahoma, yes.
Okay. What part of Oklahoma? What's your hometown?
Glenpool, just south of Tulsa.
Perfect example. Absolutely perfect example. Glenpool was like pockmarked with oil boreholes back on the turn of the century. It was the first major oil discovery in Oklahoma. I mean, it was not the first, but it was the big, massive one. Glenpool. And what happened in Glenpool, as you know, if you've seen the historical photos wherever you go in Glenpool, if you go to McDonald's or something, you probably see historical photos of the old, the literal forest of wooden oil derricks, right? Those wooden oil derricks that they used before the rotary drilling platform would actually they would punch a hole to make a borehole, to make a well. And the reason there were so many derricks over Glenpool, covering whole areas, was because there was no regulatory policy. There was no regulation against production. That wouldn't come until 1934 in Oklahoma. The Interstate Commerce Pact that required oil producers to comply to production caps, so that what would happen then is, okay, they're producing all of this oil as fast as possible. Why are they doing it as fast as possible? It's a really good example here.
Okay.
Why are the the wildcatters or the drillers trying to produce as much oil as possible over the shortest amount of time.
Minimal regulation, I would assume.
Well, why is, yeah, there's like no regulation. Let's just say there is no regulation at all. Why are they trying to do it as fast as possible? It all has to do with price and demand and supply. So in the case of Glenpool, you know, it's basically, you're only going to make a lot of money if you can get as much oil to market as fast as possible before the price collapses. So there's a demand, but there's, you know, when the supply, everybody knows the supply is going to go way up, right? And when the supply goes way up, the demand is not there and the price falls. In places like Glenpool and Cushing, the Cushing oil field, there was such an enormous supply, local supply on hand after all those wells came in, that there was no place to even store the oil. So they would divert it to creeks, they would dam up creeks, and they would literally allow the petroleum to sit in the creeks, and they would try to get it, you know, try to recover some as much as they could later. But they would basically try to get as much as possible, as fast as possible, because that's the only way you're going to make a lot of money, is selling enough as you can at a certain price before the price actually collapses. So exploitation and exit. And so what happens is that you have boom towns in places like Oklahoma, like Cushing and Glenpool, boom and bust. You know that there's going to be this rush to get as much as possible before the demand collapses and the price collapses, and there's no reason to continue. And over, you know, and that's an extreme example. Most oil field boom towns in Oklahoma and Texas lasted on the order of a couple of decades. So you have, you know, enormous numbers of people moving in. Just down the road from me, I'm here in Stillwater. Down the road is a town called Shamrock, or at least it's a ghost town called Shamrock, Oklahoma. And it was part of that Cushing oil field boom that occurred in the 19 teens and 20s. And I think it was probably like the 1920, maybe the 1930 census. The town of Shamrock had something like 20,000 people, okay? Now you find maybe 20, right? So it's like in a completely abandoned landscape, boom and bust landscape. So that's kind of what this idea of exploration, expansion, exploitation, and exit is getting at. It's not just tied to soil and tobacco or oil. It's associated with any type of commodity that is being extracted or you know, used in an unsustainable way. You're going to have great swings in the price because you have great swings in the supply. Which is was something I wanted to bring up. I'm glad you brought this up. Okay. We know about what, and I'll talk, let's see, we don't have a lot of time here. You know what a renewable resource is and a non-renewable resource is, right?
Right.
Okay. What's an example of a renewable resource?
Like timber.
Timber. Okay. And it's kind of like that example of when I was a kid. I was told that the Amazon rainforest wouldn't be around when I was an adult or when I was middle-aged like I am now, you know, but it's still here. So what's the deal? Were they lying to me? I think they were just forgetting the fact that trees grow back, okay, in some cases. So you have, at the same time as you have deforestation, you also have reforestation. Now, it's not to say we haven't had an enormous amount of deforestation in the rainforest. We have. And a lot of that has to do with, early on it was due to logging. Then it was in the 90s, 80s and 90s, cattle ranching. And today it's agriculture. Today, one of the biggest demands on rainforest land and deforestation has to do with production of soy, of all things, you know, and that soy is largely being exported to Asia, to China. So anyway, So we have processes of deforestation and reforestation, right? It's a renewable resource. Okay, so what's a non-renewable resource?
Well, in the book or some of the reading, they were talking about how minerals, a lot of minerals are,
Yeah.
once we excavate them, we can't really do anything with them unless the technology gets good enough to where it can.
Yeah, I mean, take a diamond, for example, right? You know how diamonds are created, right? I mean, we can create diamonds.
Carbon.
We can create diamonds synthetically. Let's say gold. We can't create gold synthetically, I don't think. But diamonds and gold, very precious elements. Precious, well, diamond's carbon, right? But very precious minerals, worth lots of money, okay? And we know that they're not going to be created in our lifetime. So really, anything that can be used but can't be regenerated over the course of a human lifetime, or even maybe just a few generations, that's a resource that's non-renewable. It's just not going to be renewed. It's a finite resource, if you will. So finite resource. Even old growth forests should be considered finite resources, because if they're older than a few generations. Here in Oklahoma, even though those post oak and blackjack forests that you see as you're driving through, if you're driving on the turnpike to get to Stillwater, on the Cimarron Turnpike, when you get up near like Keystone Lake, Keystone State Park is a beautiful area covered with old growth, what we call old growth cross timbers vegetation. And that's post oak and blackjack oak. Some of those trees are over 400 years old, okay? But they have not been exploited economically except for maybe fence rails or firewood. And the population is, the demand on them has not been enough to eliminate most of them. So we have an old growth forest in Oklahoma. That could probably be considered a non-renewable resource. If we were to cut all those down, it would be hundreds of years before we get them back. They're really slow growing trees. But they're not as charismatic as the giant sequoias or something in California, right? But we know that those are like, ancient trees. So we can't really consider those to be renewable resources. Now, here's the big question. We know what a renewable resource is. We know what a non-renewable resource is. Which one is most prone to depletion? And I love to ask this question because it just seems so obvious, right?
I want to say non-renewable, but I feel like in the process of a lot of that, you are destroying renewable resources.
What do you mean by that?
Like we were talking about at the beginning of the lesson, a lot of the lumber that, with the first colonists they would see is they would go out and they want to build all this farmland, but in the process, they would just tear down these forests. If they want to do the same thing with mining, they would do the same thing. They would tear it down. They talk about like water mills, using those resources and kind of tapping those out. Well,
okay, well, let's take a couple of concrete examples. Let's say, do you like seafood?
Yeah.
What's your favorite seafood? Let's say salmon.
That's a good one. Salmon.
Okay. Salmon. Salmon would be renewable or non-renewable?
Renewable.
Renewable. Okay. And let's say oil, since you're from Glenpool. Okay. And oil is non-renewable, right? Because it takes millions of years for oil to develop from dinosaur poop or whatever it is, right? So we have or dead dinosaurs. We have oil and we have salmon. Which one of those is far more prone to actual depletion, and which one of those is far less prone to actual depletion?
I'll pass this over to Jesse. I don't know.
Well, it's just something to think about, okay? And you'll see these case studies. see these case studies in which I'll be willing to say this: renewable resources are the ones that should really be careful with. They're the ones that are most delicate, that are most prone to being actually depleted and obliterated, particularly when it comes to marine fish like salmon,
Right.
tuna, just about every seafood product. And I'll also say that when it comes down to it, most non-renewable resources, finite resources like oil, natural gas, gold, lithium, whatever, are almost never going to be depleted completely. And I'll say this: in fact, there are economists that will make this argument. They will say, you know, when it comes to non-renewable resources like oil and gas that are in high demand, demand creates supply. Okay? Demand creates supply. That sounds completely out of whack, doesn't
It does.
it? Well, demand doesn't create it. Demand doesn't create the resource, but demand sure as heck creates the supply. And you see this in your lifetime with oil and gas. 10 years ago, in 2010, the United States was dependent on imported oil. We were wholly dependent on imported oil. And about half of our supply came from overseas, mostly from Venezuela and Nigeria. And today we are exporting oil. Okay, and the price of oil is so low that oil and gas producers are having a hard time. Okay, of course, because of the COVID-19 thing, the price of crude is way down because we're not working so much. But what I'm saying is that what happened around 2013, 2014, well, let's say 2010 to about 2015, what happened? There was a revolution in the technology of the oil and gas industry. And you know that as fracking, which is kind of the vernacular way of expressing it, but more accurately, you should call it hydraulic fracturing and directional drilling, or what some people will call horizontal drilling, although it's not just horizontal, it's directional. So directional drilling, hydraulic fracturing revolution, of course, is another environmentally, it's a hot potato right now, right? Has been for a while. But what it did was it created a heck of a supply, because now the known reserves of the world have to be recalculated. We've for long had an idea of how much oil is out there in the world, and a good estimate. But that was based on what was recoverable, not on what exists. Now the ability to recover is far, far exceeded, so that now we have a supply that seems to go way into the future. Okay. All right. So the economists would say supply creates demand creates supply, right? Demand creates supply. We have to get around this idea of thinking supply, provides demand, or supply is finite. Supply is never finite, unless you're talking about non-renewable resources, which can be depleted. Renewable resources. I got to edit this. Renewable resources can be depleted. Okay. Soil is a renewable resource that is lost, and you can't do much to get it back. Timber, timber can be regrown, but if you've ever been to a loblolly pine plantation in southeast Oklahoma, or northwest Arkansas, or northwest Louisiana, or anywhere in Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia, a loblolly pine plantation just isn't a forest. Okay, it's not the same thing. Marine fisheries are under huge threat, and you know, farming fish, aquaculture, is not necessarily a solution, because when we farm fish, we also affect the natural selection process. We affect how you know, natural patterns of especially andromenous fishes move and that sort of thing. So it's not something that we should expect that we can fix. We have to be very, very careful with those renewable resources.
Okay.
Water is another one. Yeah.
I was going to ask about water in particular with Cape Town in South Africa. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, huge problem right now, and you know, especially with climate change, and Cape Town itself. Cape Town is a Mediterranean climate, so it's like California, in that you have, you know, an area that is very, very pleasant typically, but in terms of water supply, has to depend on outside sources. Like Southern California gets, you know, most of the water in Southern California is coming from outside of Southern California. There's a huge deficit for it. So, but yeah, that's an example of, you might want to keep that one in mind for one of the assignments.
Okay.
Good example. All right. Well, I don't have time to show you the. Yeah, I do have time. Let's try this. We have a little bit of time left. This is a very short. This is a. It's not a historical document. It's not a historical document. It's an actor, but he's portraying Teddy Roosevelt and talking about conservation. So I think you'll like this. Whoops. Here it is. It's only 5 minutes. Can you see that?
We can see it. Cannot hear it though.
Can't hear it?
Nope.
Oh, I can hear it. Sorry. Hold on a second. Now I can't see him, but I can hear him. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll mount this thing on the lesson so y'all can watch it. It's really kind of neat. It'll make you think differently about maybe Teddy Roosevelt. Heck of a speaker. Anyway, thanks for showing up today, both of you. And I think we had some good discussion on some important topics. I might edit this a little bit so it's not so incredibly long. But thank you all for showing up and asking good questions and being prepared. All right.
All right. Take care.
Have a good one. Have a good weekend. I'll see you next week.
Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye.